This is the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Rob Riches. And at this point, I think there's only one question to ask. What the hell is going on? We'll get into the road trip, the lack of success and otherwise, but as of around 4 p.m. on Sunday, we had some potential big news to discuss with the Flyers. According to Dave Isaac of the Courier-Post, the Flyers are going to fire Dave Hakstol and hire Joel Quenneville. That was the report. National media has since come out saying that nothing is official. The team is denying that anything is happening. Apparently, Hakstol himself is going to update the media on injuries tomorrow, and a practice is scheduled for 12:30 on Monday that is going to possibly feature Dave Hakstol. At least in his mind, he's running a practice and announcing an update on injuries tomorrow. So whatever we think we know, we don't know. And nothing is official until the team announces it. It is after 9 o'clock on Sunday night as we are recording this. So for all we know, this could happen while we're recording this. It could happen afterwards. It could happen on Monday. It could happen later in the week. It could happen next week after the roster freeze for the holidays is over. It could happen in the new year. It could happen in the offseason. We simply don't know. Here's what we do know. This team needs wholesale changes. Firing Ron Hextall in order to make that happen may have been necessary, which is why it happened 2 weeks ago. If you're Chuck Fletcher and wanted to wait to evaluate things and see for yourself what this was like, then you saw enough on this road trip. You probably saw enough halfway through this road trip. And that brings us to where we are right now. It brings us to everything that we have to this point in front of us, the new GM kind of getting a feel for things like that, and really, in my mind, not needing any more time to see what's going on here. Changes are necessary in some capacity. Now, you also have a situation where the coaching situation is completely up in the air right now. You've got Dave Hakstol's future riding in the balance here. Nobody knows what's going on with that. You've got Joel Quenneville's name out there. You've got possibly other coaches in play that nobody knows about yet. You've got the minor league situation also in flux because that has some involvement in what could happen over the coming days. And also, let's not forget, the roster freeze happens on Wednesday night at midnight, so going into Thursday. The team has 3 games this week, 1 on Tuesday, 1 on Thursday, actually 4 games, 1 on Tuesday, 1 on Thursday, 1 Saturday, 1 Sunday, and then gets the typical 3 days off where there's no NHL action from the 24th through the 26th. There's a lot in front of this team that's happening quickly, and it's kind of why, from my vantage point, I was surprised that if you were going to do something with the coaching staff at one point in time, then you were also going to do, and if you were going to do something with the coaching staff and it was going to have to involve something from a more management level, like firing Ron Hextall, then it probably should have all happened at one time. Forget the idea that this is all Chuck Fletcher doing this. This is not Chuck Fletcher. This is more Dave Scott and Paul Holmgren kind of putting out the fact that they wanted to have input also probably on the coach just as much as they did the GM. And if that was the case, then I don't see any reason why you needed to have an extended evaluation period for this guy, unless he's telling you, just like Hextall was, give it a minute here and take a step back and just let this guy see the situation. Granted, they showed nothing during that week-long period to really change the minds of anybody. At the same time, it leaves a lot of questions in the air, and you wonder why we're sitting here today trying to figure out who's going to be the new head coach, if there is going to be a new head coach, and why this is all up in the air. It's another situation where the Flyers don't do anything easily or rationally, it feels like. It's always complicated. It's never just as simple. And look, I understand part of the issue here. This is not the team getting to put this information out the way they probably wanted to. They didn't want social media to be telling their head coach, you're not going to make it through Monday. They didn't want that. And I can understand that. And at the same time, when Joel Quenneville's denying that he has anything, he's accepted a job with the Flyers or anything like that. Of course he is, because Joel Quenneville's a professional. And he's a guy who also just got fired himself a month and a half ago. Do you think he's going to try to fuel the fire and basically throw the existing head coach under the bus in his final hours on the plane ride back from the road trip to say, I'm the new coach, you're the old coach? get out of my office almost, like that kind of thing. He's not going to do that. So until the Flyers get the chance to do this the way that they wanted to, it's not there. At the same time, I look at the Hakstol situation, and to an extent, I understand why this is a little bit more complicated than the GM, because when the Flyers made that announcement about Hakstol, it happened on November 26th in the morning with no report coming beforehand. It was a straight release from the team. They released the information. There it was. And it was, we just got in, all of us in the media just got informed that Ron Hextall is no longer the GM of this team. It was as simple as that. There was no behind the scenes reporting done in that regard. In this case, now there is some behind the scenes work. It's coming from people that we've known to get things right before, but it's also creating a lot of confusion in the idea that, again, this team is standing behind Dave Hakstol in a way that we've seen before, and something doesn't add up here. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire, and something tells me that there's a lot of fire going on in that front office right now. Rob, you kind of have followed along with this too all day, and it's been strange to say the least, but your initial thoughts on everything here, kind of what could be the final days, if they are the final days of Dave Hakstol, what's kind of gone into this, and also your thoughts on just the whole situation and how it's playing out.
Honestly, I mean, it's one of those things where I was saying earlier, Kevin, that I almost feel like I'm going soft because as much as I would have liked to have seen the Flyers fire Dave Hakstol, I mean, obviously, he's a family man. He's got a wife and young kids. Seeing him fired just before Christmas time, nobody wants to see that. But at the end of the day, this is a deal that needed to be done. It's something that, like I was saying on the podcast shortly after the firing of Ron Hextall that. It was something that they had to move on from Dave Hakstol because that the new general manager always wants to get his own personnel in there. That's just a given. You don't see a lot of the guys from the old regime stick around when somebody gets fired, and it's one of those things that it was going to happen at some point. So they should have just nipped it in the bud a lot sooner, just because it creates a distraction around the rest of the team. It's something where you have Hakstol getting behind the bench every night, knowing that his days are numbered. And you have the rest of the guys. That it felt like as the season was coming along that the players were starting to tune out Dave Hakstol, and it's one of those things that it felt like that was even more inevitable. That once Ron Hextall was fired, that there was no reason for those guys to listen to a word that he said. I mean, he was a dead man walking, and it's something that him kind of hanging around this long. I mean, I know he wanted Chuck Fletcher wanted to evaluate things on the West Coast road trip, but that was just. I think just prolonging things was just rough. I mean, he did come out and say that Hakstol was going to get a chance, but it just comes down to something that it's a no-win situation for everybody involved, and it's something that just becomes a distraction at the end of the day that they probably should have taken care of a lot sooner. And one question that I did have because in regards to Dave Isaac's report, Dave Isaac is one of the most credible reporters covering the Philadelphia Flyers. He's somebody whose take is always appreciated. He always provides, kind of an invigorating spin on things. I have the utmost respect for Dave Isaac's work, and if there is the smoke that he's alerting to, then that's something that it should be taken seriously. I mean, I'll trust Dave Isaac. It's something that I'll believe until I have a reason to not believe. But there was the Isaac report, and then there was the counter report, if you will, from Andy Strickland, the St. Louis Blues between the benches reporter. And the thing I didn't get about that was I was actually watching the St. Louis Blues game earlier on Sunday. That was afternoon game. They were playing Calgary, and it's something that I'm wondering that I think that was in the middle of the second period of that game that he goes tweeting that out, and it's like, well, what are you doing? You have time to check in with Joel Quenneville, while you're, watching this game, while you're basically doing your job. You're between the benches. So that's something that I didn't really quite understand. That was kind of a question that was raised on my end, but it's something where, you figured that the end of the Dave Hakstol era was coming soon. And I guess that he's on, if he wasn't on borrowed time before, I mean, goodness gracious. I mean, he's pretty much got a foot out the door at this point, and this is kind of how it's coming to an end.
It really is strange. You're also acknowledging the Andy Strickland report. There's also what Darren Dreger put out as well about how everything was status quo. And a lot of it was confusing also because at the time that all this was happening, the Flyers are on team charter back from Vancouver, which left it about 10 a.m. Pacific time. So didn't leave until Sunday afternoon in Philadelphia time, at least, and wasn't going to arrive until after 6 o'clock on Sunday evening. So there was a lot of time for a lot of stuff to come out and a lot of time for people to make kind of give their own perception of it and make some speculation and have some opinions, and not a lot of time for the team to actually put together. Well, there, in a sense, there was a lot of time for the team to put together a little bit of an exit strategy on that, but not really, because you're also just trying, it's an awkward situation for a lot of people involved, players especially, you know, but but to me, there was also a sense that they had already kind of seen the writing on the wall as well. You're right, Rob, about how it seemed like there was no reason for this team to give any mind to Dave Hakstol after a certain point when it came to the Hakstol firing. Um, and I fully understand that. And, like, to me, I look at the last two games of the road trip. If there was anything that set me off, look, let's just go from the very beginning. Not even just of the road trip, but the first game after Chuck Fletcher was officially hired as the GM. And look, they play a game against Columbus where Columbus is clearly the better team this year so far and everything like that. But you played a pretty tough third period and you got a game tied after it was 3-1, and Travis Sanheim kind of emerged in that game, and it was good to get a point, but at the same time, to make a mistake 10 seconds into overtime and give up the game that quickly was a problem. You come out, you fall behind 2-0 to Buffalo without Sean Couturier. It was a fair point at that point to write everything off. I certainly didn't have high expectations for that game, and then the Flyers go out and score 6 unanswered goals, 4 in the third period, and win the game 6-2. And you're going, interesting. Quite a start to the road trip. They get away. You almost got the sense after that game that you were wondering if it was going to be the start of another road trip that started to save people's jobs. Again, just like the other one earlier in the year that went out to California, the games against Anaheim, LA, San Jose, and then finally Arizona. You wondered if that was going to be a similar situation. They quickly kind of reverted back to the typical way that it's been. You get another one of these games where realistically the Flyers weren't all that far behind for the first half of the game. Yeah, Winnipeg was kind of trying their best to get something going. The Flyers were the better team for the first 25 minutes or so, and yet had surrendered 2 goals to 1, And when Winnipeg got the third goal, and subsequently that was the end of Michael Neuvirth's day, you brought Anthony Stolarz in, who had already played in a back-to-back situation, or was playing in back-to-back days now as a result. He had already played well in Buffalo. He had already played against Columbus as well, and you were starting to wonder where that was going to go. And from there, the game totally unraveled, a complete snowball effect into a 7-1 loss. But for me, the telling point was the game against Calgary on Wednesday, because to come out and play a game against Calgary and you fall behind in the game, just like the other one, it was a little bit back and forth at one point in time. It's 1-0 Calgary. You get it tied up. It's 2-1 off of a shorthanded goal, no less. But you come back, you score a tying goal, you get the go-ahead goal, you add an insurance goal, and it's 4-2, just like that. Even after giving up the power play goal that made it 4-3, you get a shorthanded goal of your own. It's 5-3, and time's running out. You kill off another penalty. The penalty kill was great in that game, and next thing you know, you're down to about 2 minutes left. Calgary's going to pull the goalie, and you've got a 5-3 lead. That should have been a very quality road win for a team that, A, desperately needed one, but also that would have been 2 out of 3 games on the road trip where you're going, there were parts of that game where you had no business winning the game, but you know what? You're going to find a way to do it here. And it looked like it was going to be a very motivating kind of game. And at that point, still Anthony Stolarz had played stellar in that game against Calgary, even giving up 3 goals. He had made probably, I believe at that point it was probably 35 shots faced, and he had made 32 saves to that point. So you're going, what a quality game for him. That was not an easy 32 saves. Even if you let in 3 goals, they were grade A chances. It wasn't an easy game. And then Calgary gets one with the goalie pulled. They get the other one to tie it up with 7 seconds left. And all of it was just defensive chaos in front of the net. Guys not picking up their forwards or whatever, like Sean Monahan's left completely uncovered to go after the rebound in front of the net, things like that. And that quickly in overtime. Again, another 35 seconds into overtime, and a game's over, and you're down a point. To go from that game, as frustrating as it was in a game where you've got to finish off the job, I don't care how you do it, to go from that to completely lifeless for the next two games over the weekend, one in Edmonton on Friday, one in Vancouver on Saturday. And look, Edmonton's a completely different team. I'm not going to deny that. They're definitely a better team than the Flyers are now. And yet, that was a lifeless game to fall behind. The thing about that game to me is that you're only down 1-0 through more than half of the game. To not play with any sense of urgency at all, like jobs are on the line even. This is not just about standings position anymore and trying to avoid missing the playoffs or getting a playoff spot or whatever it is. This was just about saving jobs and knowing there was a possibility that something big was coming. And from one night in Edmonton to another in Vancouver, there were already rumors starting to swirl about how whatever happens, it doesn't really matter. Dave Hakstol's future is not looking good, and something's going to probably come of this within who knows how long, but it wasn't going to be, it's interesting. You knew something big was going to happen, but whatever was going to happen with Dave Hakstol, it just seemed like this road trip was a chance for the Flyers to put to rest any idea of any further changes happening. And to me, while Dave Hakstol's part of the problem here and probably needs to go as well, I'm not saying that the Flyers are making the wrong decision here by firing the coach by any stretch, if that's where they are going with this. But I do think that there is so much more that needs to be done beyond that. And I think it starts a little bit with shaking up your core a little bit, making these players feel like nothing is safe in this game. We've seen it happen on so many occasions, and the players feel like they're responsible for a coach getting fired or a GM getting fired or whatever the difference is, and it just seems to me that, the GM getting fired was supposed to light a fire under the organization. And it's been 3 weeks now since that happened. You got a week without really much activity because of the fact there was no new GM in place. A new GM got hired 1 week after the firing of Ron Hextall, so Chuck Fletcher's in, and now you're 2 weeks in, and the only reason you're 2 weeks in is because you only had one game realistically in that first week, and then you played the 5-game road trip over about a 8 or 9 day spell. So that kind of was going to answer the rest of your questions here. And, maybe if you go 3-2 on the road trip, you bought yourself a little more time. You're going to buy yourself this 3-game homestand. You're going to buy yourself up until the holidays. Maybe you're going to buy yourself into the new year. It's really tough to say. They got another 5-game road trip coming up that spans, or not 5-game road trip, but it's 5 road games that span over pre-holiday and post-holiday. And the post-holiday part includes Tampa and Florida and Carolina and Nashville all on the schedule. And the interesting thing to me is that as I looked at the road trip and similarly look at the games upcoming and the road trip that's upcoming, you don't find a game that looks favorable for the Flyers at all. Calgary certainly wasn't favorable after the Winnipeg game. Edmonton wasn't favorable with the way they've been playing since they made a coaching change. And Vancouver wasn't favorable just because of the back-to-back and the way the team is so fragile. You look at the games coming up and you go, Detroit's been better than expected. Nashville's an elite team in the league, and everybody knows it. You've got another game against Columbus on Saturday, and that's, you saw what Columbus gave you the first time around this month, so you kind of know what to expect. Maybe you get something out of that. That's probably one of the closest level games there is, and then you got the Rangers on Sunday. And all of that's well and good, and then you're going to go on the road. You're going to get Florida, Tampa first, and Tampa's probably the class of the league right now. Florida's maybe a little more manageable, but you never know. Carolina, same deal, but Carolina's been playing decently this season as well. And Nashville again. And again, Nashville's an elite team. So by the time you return home in the new year, were you going to wait that long? I mean, by that point, it's more than a lost season. At the very least, you can try to implement some things and go from there. And I don't know where it's going to go from here, and I don't know. I really can't say I know what to expect even going into Monday, just because it sure seemed like when something was going to come out that had some honesty behind it. And all the writing is on the wall that this should have been the end. And so far, it hasn't been. Now, tomorrow could be different than today, but it's really, really hard to tell where this is going. And that's the biggest thing right now with this, is that it's never done easily. It's never done normally. It's done difficult all the time. It's always got to be difficult with this team in terms of the way it goes. And that's a lot of dysfunction for an organization that prides itself on being well put together and competing and contending and making the playoffs on a regular basis. And that's the whole deal with that. And being good as a business entity as well, being a successful business in terms of putting fans in the seats. I don't know how the fans can trust anything after this. I think for a change in, again, and I think I've used this line before on the podcast, without trying to get too political, if you will, because and it really doesn't have anything to do with politics necessarily as much, but look, people throw out the fake news thing all the time. And at what point, for a change, you've got a lot of people in among the Flyers fans who are looking at these reports coming out that this is what's going to happen. And I'm not saying that people are taking it as gospel, but they're taking it from a sense of clearly there's something going on here. And if something's going on here, why don't you just come forward and tell everybody? It's actually, you're seeing the multi-million-dollar organization in a professional sports league being questioned more than the media. And that doesn't mean the media is always right or the media doesn't get a few things wrong, but it's where's like a counter statement here? Even from, the team needs to address this, and more than just by saying nothing's going to happen tonight or just by saying Dave Hakstol's our coach. You're toying with people's emotions if this information is leaking out. You're toying with the fact that clearly you need to make a business smart decision as much as anything to just get people's interest again. And the idea, look, that headline of a report being out of saying that there's a report that Dave Hakstol will be fired and Joel Quenneville will be hired, that totally moves the needle for everybody. It gets people interested again. Here's a guy people have been waiting for, knowing he was a free agent head coach, and a guy that has been the ire of everybody throughout the entire process, through so much of his almost 4 seasons here, if you want to go that far with it. And it's like, you're really toying around with stuff if it's out there that something's going to happen and then nothing happens, and it's going to create a lot of issues and a lot of anger. Now, Rob, I do want to get your thoughts on let's kind of go into the hypotheticals here, because let's assume that this eventually is Joel Quenneville's job. I know that we have talked about him before as a possibility here, and there's some idea to the fact that you're watching you watch 2 former Flyer head coaches get new jobs virtually within the same week of each other or close to. You watched St. Louis fire their coach Mike Yeo and just move Craig Berube into the interim position, and then you watch Todd McClellan get fired by Edmonton and Ken Hitchcock take over and come out of retirement for it, and it's yielded 2 different results. Craig Berube doesn't really, from experience of his time here, it doesn't really scream head coaching decision. It's more interim and it's more temporary. But at the same time, you look at what Ken Hitchcock, a Hall of Fame coach, has been able to do in Edmonton since then, and you wonder what a guy like Joel Quenneville will be able to do with a team that was supposed to have potential and supposed to be competing and certainly supposed to have a style that warrants everything another team's got and not getting blown out of a building constantly. But we've watched them get blown out of the building several times. And you wonder what that does to an entire coaching staff, what it does to younger players as well. I mean, you got to think about Joel Quenneville and the idea of him coaching a Nolan Patrick or a Travis Konechny or an Ivan Provorov and Shane Gostisbehere. Guys who, you got to think about guys who have had their share of struggles this year, who maybe haven't worked the best in Hack's system at all. Dave Hakstol has tried to do everything he can to probably make this thing work here, but the lineups just don't match up and don't add up and things like that. And, look, a lot of that falls on Chuck Fletcher as well. Chuck Fletcher's not here and now with Dave Hakstol, but it will with Joel Quenneville should that be the decision made. Joel Quenneville's going to play who he thinks gives him the best shot to win a game. Chuck Fletcher's got to put together a team that Joel Quenneville can work with, So that's where more of this may come into it. If Joel Quenneville wants to play a guy like Yuri Lateref 75 games, he's more than welcome to do it if a guy's part of a roster. That's his decision as a head coach. But you don't play a guy like Yuri Laterra if he's not there to play him. And I'm not saying that means to make a trade. What I'm saying is that at the end of the season, when a guy's contract is up, if he's not there, he's not there. You can't play him. So it's up to Chuck Fletcher to kind of find the holes and make some decisions based on what he thinks can get you the best value in return. And that may mean trading a big name player or a core guy to get another player who's going to be part of your core later. That's where it kind of goes. But Rob, we've talked about Joel Quenneville before. I know you're pretty high on him. I've been high on him too. I think he's got a great personality. I think he's a guy who wears his heart on his sleeve a lot and shows the emotion that people like to see behind the bench. Very much in that sense, very much a Lavi type, but also just a guy who's a really smart hockey guy, been around, taken teams to the Stanley Cup before and won championships and done a lot of different things. Your take on the idea that it could be Joel Quenneville?
Yeah, I mean, what it comes down to is, one thing that I've been thinking about is whether or not Joel Quenneville actually wants to get back into coaching right now. And it's something where, obviously, I mean, nobody saw that firing coming. Nobody expected that, Chicago would have let him go. I mean, I think that, when you don't not only just break a 49-year Stanley Cup drought, but win two more after that one, I think that you pretty much can stay there as long as you want, basically. And I mean, obviously, that's why I'm not, calling the shots and running the show in the National Hockey League. But it's something where, I mean, Quenneville's a guy who, he's had health issues in recent years, and obviously the chance to kind of spend time with the family. I mean, or work a TV gig or something. It comes down to whether or not he wants to maybe just kind of hang by the rest of the season and kind of get after it next year. But then on the other side of the coin, it's something where you look at Joel Quenneville. I mean, he's a guy who's always been a relentless competitor throughout his NHL career. I mean, especially we learned, we saw it when he was with St. Louis, when he was with Colorado, when he was with Chicago. I mean, he's a guy who stops at absolutely nothing to win. He's a guy who expects a lot out of his players and and gets results. Players don't mind playing for him because he can get results, and it's something where that's the kind of thing that you don't see every day. He's a guy that he wants to win just as much as anybody else. And I mean, especially I think considering the circumstances surrounding his departure with the Blackhawks, I think he wants to get right back into it. He wants to get right back behind the bench, and he wants to continue being the relentless competitor he is. I mean, he's a guy who's very serious business. He's not messing around. And he's somebody who he's a kick in the ass that these players can use. And for him to get back into it, I mean, I think it's something that he's going to want. I think it's something that's going to be real good for him. And it also comes down to how he feels he can help things out and right the ship. And I think what it also comes down to is whether or not what else Chuck Fletcher has assessed in his time, in his short time with the team so far. What else he's seen on the West Coast trip. Does he think that the team can turn things around? Does he think that they have the talent to do so? Is it something where they can try to make a push for the playoffs, try to get in, try to get to the expectations that were set upon the team at the start of the season, where not just getting into the playoffs and a wild card or a third seed, but winning winning a playoff series and just moving on in the Stanley Cup playoffs. It's been too long since they had won in the playoffs, since they got past the first round. And does he think that they have the talent to get back to the second round, or are they better off just kind of taking it is what it is kind of season and getting at it next year? And does it come down to moving some pieces around, moving some expiring contracts, even trading Wayne Simmons, which nobody wants to see right away, but if it's got to happen, it's got to happen. We all know the business of hockey. So, I mean, it's something where, there's a lot to go with. I mean, there's a lot more observations that Fletcher's gathered so far, and we've seen the Flyers play, several different brands of hockey during the Chuck Fletcher era so far, whether or not it was that team that, rallied to take down the Sabres at the start of the road trip, or the team that just completely collapsed like a house of cards against Calgary. It's something where, there's a number of different things that Chuck Fletcher has gathered so far, and obviously we'll see how that goes. I mean, Joel Quenneville is a guy who can make an immediate impact. He's one of the more successful coaches you'll see. I mean, he's a Stanley Cup pedigree, and he's a guy that's going to expect a lot, and it's something where you definitely also have to understand that he's not going to try to take on a situation where the team's kind of floundering a little bit. He's going to want to, he wants to win. He expects the best. He demands a lot, and that's all you can really ask for. He's a guy that I think Philadelphia can really embrace, and it's something where if he does get brought into the fold, I mean, it should definitely keep things interesting.
Yeah, and I agree with you on Joel Quenneville being a competitor, and I think a great footnote to this is very recent with the road trip taking the Flyers through Edmonton and Ken Hitchcock being the coach there. Ken Hitchcock's 66 and recently came out of retirement, if you will, to coach Edmonton, and he talked about that in his media availability before that game, and even said, look, he was talking to Rick Wilson, the new Flyers assistant coach, about that as well, and it's like, you're sitting at home and there's things you could be doing, but you can't watch a game the same way, and he has an itch to get back there. I don't have a doubt in my mind that Joel Quenneville is sitting out of a job right now, potentially with an offer coming in very soon, and not itching to get back in some way. And as much as he's a win now guy, I do think that competitive edge and that itch to compete is something that fuels coaches and makes them embrace situations that are challenging. This is going to be a challenging situation, at least for the rest of this season, because you've got a lot of figuring out to do. Quenneville doesn't really have to worry about that if he's the guy, because I don't think he's going to have to make significant decisions that are expected to turn this team around. But I do think that having a new guy behind the bench can also provide some insight to Chuck Fletcher as well about guys who aren't pulling their weight completely, guys who aren't contributing the way we think they are or whatever. When I look at this team the way it's constructed, I look and I don't think that there's anything that's going to happen to a guy like Claude Giroux. I don't think there's anything that's going to happen to a guy like Sean Couturier. And I don't think there's anything that's going to happen to a select number of the young players. But there's a lot of guys I do think are going to be available. And I think at the very forefront, I start with two of the most veteran guys on the core that aren't named Claude Giroux, and that's Jake Voracek and Wayne Simmons. And I think the issue that I have with this, not with them being on the block necessarily, but the issue I have with those two players is that Claude Giroux's been experiencing success throughout the years, and it's a little bit of an underrated success because of the way the team has performed. But he's consistently been a fairly good player point-wise throughout the years. He had it, and he had his downs at one point in time, but over the last 2 years, this season included,
He's what? I think he's second in points since 2010 or something like that.
And even in franchise history, think about his placement in franchise history, second in all-time in assists, and ranking right up there in points. I believe he's fourth in points, I think. It's, he's right up there. And in games played, by the end of this season, I believe he's going to be somewhere in near the top 5 and approaching top 3 status very soon. So he's played a long time here. He's had continued success. There's so many things for him that have made it work. And you know what? He's made it work over a lot of different changes. He's made it work while John Stevens was still coaching this team very early in his career. He made it work when Peter Laviolette was the coach. He made it work when Craig Berube was the coach, and he's made it work when Dave Hakstol is the coach, and he'll make it work when Joel Quenneville or anybody else is the head coach. He's been that good of a player, but it's a little bit underappreciated because the team success isn't there. I look at Wayne Simmons and I look at Jake Voracek and I go, these are guys that are on the opposite end of the spectrum where I go, yeah, they're good players. They've had career years under Dave Hakstol. They've had career years under guys before then. And at the same time, I wonder if you can't do better. If you're going to move guys to get value, maybe you move a veteran who can net you something worthwhile in return. I don't know that Wayne Simmons is going to get any better than he was years ago. And with all the injuries he had in recent years, especially last season, maybe he's kind of hit his maximum abilities here and his capabilities, and that's all you can ask for at this point is whatever he's given you is what you're going to get, and it might still be 15, 20 goals a year, but it's not the same Wayne Simmons that was there before, so that's the thing. To look at a guy like Voracek also, I feel like accountability comes into play a little bit because there's plays where, I think about earlier in the year, Jake Voracek had an issue with the back checking in some ways, and he's not one of those guys. I look at even somebody younger to go Travis Konechny in overtime against Calgary, to be a defender back on that rush and to get back to let the first shot go through and make the save, and do all that. But then to instantly break out and try to get up the ice to get a rush the other way and not focus on the play that's there to leave a guy unmarked so he can go and put in a rebound is a problem. And I highly doubt that from Wednesday's game to Friday's game that anything was addressed about that based on the way things looked. And that's all I can speculate with that is that if they looked the way they did on Friday, then nothing was really addressed from what happened on Wednesday. And I think the Flyers need a head coach that's going to address those issues. I do agree with you, and I think that there's parts of the reports that have validated this a little bit. I do agree with you that that it's you have to wonder if Quenneville's interested in this job immediately or if he wants a little bit of extra time to still be at home and still enjoy some time with family before getting back into this thing completely head on. The holiday break is close enough at this point, with one more week of games to go. There's 4 games over the course of the next 7 days. Then you get the 3-day holiday break and the team goes and plays in Tampa on the first day back from that break on the 27th. Maybe that's when things start to happen. But, I don't know that there's a lot of weight to that either, but I do understand that that's a possibility. And if it is, look, I have no issues at all if the Flyers decide temporarily that Scott Gordon's going to coach this team. That's fine. I don't think you have anything to lose in 4 more games that you haven't already lost before during this road trip, that you can't wait 4 games for a guy to be ready to take the job, to verbally accept and just start later than December 18th. That part to me is fine. But that's really where this comes in. I think the Flyers, as much as Joel Quenneville's a win now kind of guy, and I'm curious to see what he would be like with younger players like Konechny, Provorov, Nolan Patrick, guys like that. I look at him and I think you've got a lot more potential with him than you do with the other options available, and that's where I would take this thing. To this point, that's exactly where I would take it, and I think that he was, if everything lines up the way that it does, and we talked about him when he became available, and it was mentioned by ownership that when he was fired, from Chicago, it was kind of an eye opener. It was he's out there, maybe this is the type of guy that the team needs to take a step forward. I don't know that the team is constructed the way it needs to be for him to take that step forward, but I wonder if Toronto was when Mike Babcock took over, knowing there were young players involved in that too. I don't know if they were ready to take that big step, and I think they're getting there as well after a couple of years. So maybe you give Quenneville a little bit of time here too, and use the rest of this year to build the roster. And I don't think anybody's gonna have a problem, even in the fan base, if Joel Quenneville's the coach and the team doesn't make the playoffs this year because the team needs changes. If Quenneville's not getting something out of the team and they make more changes, you'd like to see that, because I think people know that Quenneville's style has worked before in this day and age of the NHL. It's just trying to make it work with a team that maybe isn't completely constructed the way it needs to be. That's probably where this is going to go, and I wonder what kind of moves we can expect to see following that. But I do know that at the very least that whatever happens, you've got Monday and Tuesday, and then whatever bit of Wednesday you're going to use, and you're going to have a break from all of this because nothing can happen. No trades can be made, no roster decisions, nothing. And I think you're going to be able to sit back and actually breathe for a second and see the situation as well. And that's kind of why I think a new coach at this time isn't really a bad thing, because give him the 4 games this week to get a feel for things. There's no harm there. And let the roster freeze. Let the players kind of be there to give him a chance to see what's out there and who's playing well, who's not, give his input potentially. There's a lot of respect between everybody in that would be in this organization and Joel Quenneville. I think Quenneville's track record obviously speaks for itself, but I think his reputation of being a fairly straightforward kind of guy would also be there. I mean, I don't know too many people who are very straightforward and honest when it comes to the media and talking about their team. Quenneville's one of those guys. I think Quenneville ranks right up there with the likes of Babcock, and Barry Trotz is another guy I think of who really isn't afraid to say anything when it comes to it. It is what it is, and he's not, I feel like one thing that Dave Hakstol always has done is kind of tried to take the safe approach with that kind of stuff, and he's not going to throw players under the bus. And I'm not saying that these coaches do, but they aren't afraid to be honest about it. You know, John Tortorella is like that too. You like guys who, as a coach, have a little bit more, not brutal honesty, but aren't afraid to sit there and look at the end of the day and go, I didn't like that. I didn't like this part of our game. I didn't like our whatever. I didn't like our third period. I didn't like our special teams. And who knows, you know, one of the things that we're not discussing at all because it's not part of any report is, hey, you know, what happens to the rest of the assistant coaching staff? I do believe that Rick Wilson is safe because that's a fairly recent hire, and that's also a Chuck Fletcher hire. So I think Rick Wilson is safe, and I think that you would talk to a guy like Joel Quenneville or anybody you would bring in to get a feel for it and to make sure the guy's okay with that coach. But also, I think that anybody who's hired would bring in their own coaching staff and try to turn this thing around quickly. It's just, you know, even with as well as the penalty kill is played in some of the recent games, I think definitely the Calgary game stands out for sure. But it's just not where it needs to be, and I don't see how you can hire a new coach potentially and not give him free range to bring in some assistance here and do what he has to do. And I don't think that they would balk at that decision at all. I do think that there could be you have the potential here for a change to be made at the AHL level as well, especially if you let Scott Gordon serve as an interim coach for any length of time. You wonder if somebody like Chris Knobloch, who was brought in 2 seasons ago, would move to the AHL and take over as head coach there potentially. That was one of the rumors that was floated around weeks ago. And I honestly could see it a little bit just because, while Knobloch hasn't been a great coach when it comes to the power play, and the power play has struggled this year, I do think he's got something for a younger team and for a team that's still in a developmental league. He's certainly known how to coach great junior players at Erie, so I think he can make something out of that as well. At this point, that's really all the information that we know and kind of speculating on everything. Now we kind of just focus on talking about where this stuff goes from here. You know, we mentioned that you got the 4 games this week to start with, and then you've got 5 that are all, you got 5 that are all on the road, starting with 4 games this week and then 4 more on the road to start following the holiday break before you finally return home on January 3rd against Carolina. And there's a lot of things that come into play in that time because, for a change, you know, you lost that big gap. We had talked about the big gap between games. You had a game on November 27th against Ottawa, then didn't play again until December 1st against Pittsburgh, then didn't play again until December 6th. And what you did during that time was you had fired a GM, you let one game come and go. The 3 days before the Pittsburgh game came and went, you were still searching for a GM, and you had a GM by the end of the weekend. In this case, you don't have the time to really play around and get a feel for things. You're just going to kind of go in ready to go here. And it'll be interesting to see what happens as it gets closer to practice on Monday to see if this goes anywhere, because it sure feels like there's a lot of substance to this, even though there's conflicting reports. And I think it will be very shocking and very, it's not going to be met well if there is nothing, if there is no truth to this at all. I just don't see how all of this can come out, and knowing, you know, that there's a lot of people who have a lot of things being said about this, but I do feel like there was a lot of noise being made on Saturday leading up to that Vancouver game. The result wasn't going to really probably matter, but the result certainly didn't help to change things. And I think that everything that's coming out right now has some merit to it in some way. I think that there's a lot to consider and um, there's just a lot to process. But I think there's some credibility to all of it, and I think that something's going to happen very soon. And it probably, you know, I can't see this team making a coaching change beyond Tuesday's game. I can only see this happening effective on Monday, so you can get ready for the game on Tuesday. And perhaps part of this is to hold a practice on Monday where Scott Gordon's running the show for a game. I know that they believe that, you know, the belief is that Dave Hakstol is going to run that practice and anticipates being the guy behind the bench on Tuesday, but who knows? You know, we'll see what happens. It's going to be certainly going to be a crazy ride through the rest of this week and through everything else. And for what it's worth, while we've talked about the potential, the name we've talked about the name we've heard as the possible replacement, we've talked about the coach that may be on the way out, and at the same time, we're not going to limit ourselves to just this podcast episode for this week if something more should happen before the roster freeze. We're going to wait it out a little bit. Even if something happens on Monday, we won't come back on Monday, but we'll come back later in the week potentially, because who knows if there's a lot of things going on with this and this coaching change that for all we know, it's going to happen. And, if that's what happens, we will have more to talk about at that point. But for now, there's really not a lot we can talk about other than the team's struggles and the guys that aren't really performing well and the players that maybe need to step up a little bit, or maybe the players that do need to hear a new voice as well. It just seemed like by the time the Saturday game rolled around, it wasn't necessarily fatigue as much as it was just frustration and trying to figure out what else could go wrong and not really feeling up to playing at a high level. And that's how you lose games 4-1 and 5-1 and really don't look like you showed up for most of it. When something's going to happen, usually you can get a sense for it. And there was a sense that something was going to happen here. So, Rob, let me kind of get you back in on this here and get your feel on what this week holds. If there's anything else that could happen outside of a coaching change, if there is a coaching change, what do you think this week and the weeks ahead kind of hold for the Flyers?
It's something where we're going to see how quickly they want to move, and what their plan is, what their vision is from there. Because it's something where it's obviously it's still very much a real possibility, like how you mentioned how Dave Hakstol is going to be running practice on Monday afternoon. But let's say that they're not able to get to anything on Monday afternoon. What's it going to be like at Wells Fargo Center? How's the atmosphere if Dave Hakstol somehow returns behind the bench as the Flyers host the Red Wings? I mean, that's something where that's not going to be. It's going to get a bit rowdy, I feel, but it's something where we'll definitely see how it goes. I mean, Joel Quenneville's, or if Joel Quenneville is hired, or if that does come to fruition, I mean, it all comes down to however it's not just going to be the only step. I mean, there's going to be some other steps that come along with that. I mean, I have a feeling that Chuck Fletcher's not going to be done just yet, and we'll definitely see what he does and how he moves. Any other moves that are considered, expiring contracts, big name guys, what have you, that we've all been kind of mentioning and all been hitting on. And it's something where you know you figured that that Dave Hakstol's days are you can count them on one hand at this point, and it's something where obviously it is what it is. I mean, it probably should have happened a lot sooner, and the organization really didn't put themselves in a good spot with the way things went down today. With like there's all sorts of conflicting information going on while the team is over the sky in a cross country, in the middle of a cross country flight. It's something where you never know how it's going to go. I mean, obviously there's sources all over the place, and that's just leaks coming left and right. I mean, I know that was something that Ron Hextall was trying to avoid, and obviously that's kind of a testament to how things have gone on in the post Hextall era. But it's something where when it comes down to it, I mean, we'll see how it goes. There's going to be further moves made, and obviously this week just kind of seems like it's the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. You made a great point about Tuesday's game too, and I don't know what I'm going to be walking into on Tuesday night when I go to be upstairs in the press box on Tuesday night for this game against Detroit. But I don't think fans are going to be disappointed if Joel Quenneville's not the guy behind the bench on Tuesday. Because if there's a time frame and the idea is that he'll be here eventually, I think people are fine with an interim head coach taking the reins for a couple of games. I don't think people feel like there's anything they have to lose. I think people just want to see the upside of what's on the other side. If it's Dave Hakstol coaching that game on Tuesday, I think people are going to feel a little, not cheated, but they're going to feel lied to a little. They're going to feel like you kind of wonder, who do you trust after that? Do you trust the reports that were coming out that said this was going to happen, or do you lose trust for the team that you thought was that wouldn't confirm it, and wonder why this hasn't been made? Because it sure seemed like people had an inside view that something was going to happen. The media's been wrong before, but at the same time, I just don't think that there's still too much smoke, in my opinion, and I worry that I worry about what the atmosphere will be like if it's Dave Hakstol coaching Tuesday's game against Detroit, because if he's coaching Tuesday's game against Detroit, unless an announcement is made effective immediately after the game on Tuesday, then I think he survives Wednesday. I think he coaches a game on Thursday. And at that point, he's coaching a game on Saturday, and he's coaching a game on Sunday, and he's going into the holidays with his job. And I don't know that people are going to put up with 3 more home games and another week of this. And I know that if Dave Hakstol's up behind the bench on Tuesday, from the drop of the puck until the end of the game, no matter what the score is, no matter what the team is doing, you're going to hear fire Hakstol chants throughout the night. And it's going to be very distracting, and it's going to be very present. It's going to be very telling about what people think about the coach and the organization. And then look, they've made their feelings known before, but you have a chance to really rile up a lot of people here. And I don't know that I don't know that you're in a position to do that with the way that business has been this particular season. And the fact that you're not performing well and you're losing people's interest, I just don't see how this is making any semblance of sense to drag this on any more than it's already gone. People weren't going to I think nobody was going to be opposed to giving Chuck Fletcher the benefit of the doubt to observe a situation. But if you need more observation than this past week, I think you're crazy. I think everything that you would need to see and want to see has been out there, done, and there's no reason to look any further. I think you've got all the answers you need, and it's go time to make some decisions and make some changes. And I think the biggest one in the last 2 games in particular was that the locker room looked lost, and it looked like Dave Hakstol was on thin ice. And I think that at that point, I think it was only a matter of time. You got to do what you got to do at this point. And the reports seem to indicate that we were heading to that point as of Sunday, and now we don't have any information yet, and we're going to go into Monday wondering the same thing. So I wonder, that's an I wonder, but there will be, Monday's going to be interesting. Tuesday is going to be interesting depending on what happens on Monday, and we'll have to just go from there and see what happens. But like I said to all of our listeners out there, we normally don't follow up one episode with another one in fairly short order, but this feels pretty significant. The idea, believe it or not, what I'll explain to our listeners right now, Rob, we had talked about this beforehand behind the scenes a little bit, but I'll explain it to everybody who's listening right now. Our intention was that this was probably going to be our last episode of 2018, at least, because like the players, like anybody else, you get a little break over the holidays, and we were going to do that as well. We were going to let these 4 games kind of come and go. There wasn't much of a gap to do a recording and then publish the podcast without it being over that holiday break. So we wanted to take that holiday time off as well, watch the next few games, and come back with you in the new year. But we did leave room potentially for the idea that should something big happen, we may have to come back and do an extra show here and not be done with everything. And sure enough, we didn't actually have any plans to do another show even regarding this information as it came out earlier on Sunday, because the thought was if it was all announced by Sunday night, we would be able to discuss it now, and there's really nothing else to discuss unless a trade was made. But in this case, we have nothing known, and should something happen on Monday or Tuesday, then Wednesday would be a perfect opportunity to discuss it more and discuss it with some more finality, and the idea that it was much more of a definite than just speculating on whether Dave Hakstol is on his way out or not, whether Joel Quenneville is coming in or not, or whether somebody else is coming in to coach his team, like a Scott Gordon, or even a guy, any other free agent head coaches out there like Todd McClellan or Mike Yeo. Obviously, Mike Yeo's got some history with Chuck Fletcher as well from the days in Minnesota, so that's a name that should be dangled out there as well. Not that he's necessarily a better fit than Quenneville or the guy that they want more or less. It's more or less to just point out that anybody who's available is a possibility, and at least there's another link to somebody within the organization now, being Chuck Fletcher, that has a connection to Yo and could be a reason why it would happen. But I don't know that. I truthfully don't know that you have anybody else. That you have any other reason to worry about this at this point. I think you wait and see, and if there's something to come out, we'll be back with more discussion, because it will be a decision that has been made, not one that's up in the air right now. That we're waiting on. We're waiting on Monday at this point. It seems, the later it gets, the more you realize you're waiting for it, and we're waiting for something. We feel like something's going to go down soon, and if if there's reason to discuss it, we will certainly discuss it. So at this point, we have gone with you for the better part of an hour, talking about a lot around the Flyers coaching situation. This was originally going to be more about the road trip and where we go from here and where the team decides to go and where, what maybe Dave Hakstol's future was and what the players' future was and the idea of what changes could be coming soon, if there are any, or just the fact that Chuck Fletcher was going to have to start doing something about it, because if you didn't like what you saw, which he shouldn't have, then that was the next step. Now we had a totally different angle on it. The road trip performance meant very little because of the fact that there is a pending decision already out there. So as we wrap things up for this portion of the show, hope maybe for this week, maybe not. As we, at least knowing the situation in the state it is now, Rob, any final thoughts before we wrap it up for the night?
Yeah, I just want to say that if it does turn out that this is the final Flyerdelphia podcast episode of the Dave Hakstol era, I just want to go on record as saying that, for much of his tenure in Philadelphia, pretty much from when he was hired to, I guess, November of this year, I was a Dave Hakstol fan. I was a Dave Hakstol defender. I was on board with the hire from the get-go. I thought he was somebody who could really work with developing the young talent and developing, helping, build these guys for NHL success. And you look at his track record with NHL caliber guys that he's worked with in North Dakota, and just it comes down to something where I did have a deep admiration for the work that he had done with the Philadelphia Flyers, and I do wish that he did have a better result, but we know how it goes. I mean, the team just needs a new voice, and that's how it is sometimes. I mean, he obviously it's a learning experience for him, and it's something that we'll see how it all shakes out. But obviously, if it is the end, I thank him for what he's done with the Flyers, and just all the best to him going forward. I mean, he was an interesting guy, neat guy, class, and it's something where you hate to see it, but that's just how it is, and that's how it's always been. That's how it's always going to be.
I want to piggyback off of your point there, Rob, because having been around him, people see the press conference Dave Hakstol, the one where, in the suit and tie after a game and kind of working his way around questions to not throw a player under the bus and things like that. What people don't see as much is the practice Dave Hakstol. And Dave Hakstol, in those situations when it's a little bit more intimate and there's not as many people there and not as many reporters around, things like that, he's got more of a personality than you think. He's a funnier guy than you think. He's willing to crack a joke every now and then. And it's, it's perfectly fair to look at this and go, he got a little bit of a raw deal in terms of the way that the fans treated him at times. I do believe that the team needs a new voice. I do believe that the team is going to be better off without him. I do believe it's one of the things of Ron Hextall's time with the Flyers that ultimately proved to not work and was a failure. I don't buy that Dave Hakstol is not going to get another NHL coaching job, because he did get two teams that really probably didn't have any right making the playoffs to the playoffs. I think in the right situation, he could be a solid NHL coach. I don't think the situation was ever right here because the pressure was, quite frankly, too high. I think one of the big mistakes of his tenure here, should it be over, was his very first season. And the thing about his very first season was it was a team that didn't have expectations, didn't have any hopes of making the playoffs, and he got them into a position to make the playoffs, and they made the playoffs. And that set the tone for a faster rebuild. People wanted that to be over faster, and people wanted it to be much more, not even much more significant, but they just wanted to be, you wanted to see them string together performances. And that's why by year 4 of this, it turned into, you can't be satisfied with just making the playoffs anymore. It's got to be win a playoff series, take the next step. You've been to the playoffs 2 out of 3 years under this coach and have gone nowhere. Well, it was heading the opposite of a playoff appearance, and it was headed the opposite of somewhere. It was still going nowhere. And the situation just was that in this city and this team, I don't think this city wanted to see a guinea pig in terms of, let's see what happens with the college guy, see if it works. It worked for a year. That first year it worked, and it got them into the playoffs ahead of schedule. And then year 2, it didn't work as well. In year 3, boy, they had to fight back hard to get into the playoffs. And now year 4, it's not working either, and you're playing the same thing from the bottom. And I just don't know that there's anything else that you can do at this point other than to make this decision and try to get somebody in here who's going to be much more accountable, a little bit more demonstrative on the bench, because people didn't like to see that Dave Hakstol wasn't demonstrative and didn't showcase his emotions more on the bench. And at the end of the day, if Joel Quenneville is going to be the guy, you're going to get that. You're going to get a guy who holds players accountable, who doesn't put up with anything that isn't a hard-working, honest effort, and he's not going to be afraid to show off, his frustration or his disappointment with a call or or whatever. He's going to showcase that as well. So if this is the guy that comes in, you're going to get a guy who's much closer to what Peter Laviolette was and not as much what Dave Hakstol was. And we'll see where it goes. But I do agree with you. I think there's more to the man than there was the coach in a sense. He's a family guy. He's certainly a little bit more personable off the ice than he is when you just get him in that press conference setting after a game. And you know what? At the end of the day, I think that's what people didn't see and what ultimately turned people against him. So that's really the situation, and we'll go from there. Maybe we have another thing left. If this is the last time we're on here with Dave Hakstol as the head coach, or for that matter, the last time we're on here during 2018, 2018 had its moments early on. That run to the playoffs was pretty amazing, and you get to, you do have a playoff series, and the way that Game 5 went and the way Game 6 started against the Penguins certainly gave you a reason to believe that this team was closer than what they are now. But so far this year, there have been not so many of those moments, and only, and a lot of frustrating moments, and that's why we're here. That's why this is where it's at, and I don't think there's anything else that you can say other than it feels like it's time, and time will only tell if this is where it's going to go. All right, so that's going to do it for the Flyerdelphia podcast for this week. We do want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Flyerdelphia podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. Subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. And remember to check us out on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly podcast network. Remember, you can listen to us and the rest of the shows on the Philly sports scene throughout the podcast network. And as we've told you in the past, it's a busy time for everyone in Philadelphia sports right now. The Phillies Nation podcast on Sports Talk Philly covers the Phillies. Free agency is in full swing. The Phillies recently signed Andrew McCutchen. They're looking at other free agents as well. Obviously, Bryce Harper and Manny Machado are all in the middle of that, and there's other names floating around as well in regards to pitching and all that stuff. There's a lot of things going on, and so you definitely want to stay tuned for that. The Pick Swap pod covering the Sixers, who won a game in Cleveland on Sunday, so they're on a little bit of a high as well. They're doing pretty well with everything when Jimmy Butler's been able to play. They lost a couple of games last week, but they've been doing well. And the Kelly Green boys covering the Eagles, and as we're recording this on Sunday, the Eagles are playing the Rams in Sunday Night Football, and holy smokes, do we have a shocker going on right now, because the Eagles haven't looked great this year, but they are leading 30-13 on the Los Angeles Rams, a team that's 11-2 this year with, limited time left in this game. There's not much left to go, and it's been a strange of a day as it's been in the hockey world. It's turning out to be a strange day in the football world too, because somehow or other the Eagles are going to possibly with a big win in this game potentially find a way to be still in contention in the NFC East and the division. So if this is our final episode before the holidays and of 2018, then we do want to say that we pass along our best wishes for this holiday season. A Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year to all of our listeners, and we will see you again in 2019. But if there is more big news to come in the coming days, we will be back probably later this week with another episode to really put a wrap on the whole situation and get to the new year and the new beginnings that will be for the Flyers, should there be a new head coach and possibly anything else going on. So, once again, thank you for tuning in. For Rob Riches, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heeney.